Hello and welcome to part 7, which is Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction, as well as the conclusion for this week's class. You're almost there, a few more minutes, then you'll be done for this week. We're going to be talking about the end of Reconstruction. Last time we talked about how the myth of black rule, as well as the rise of the KKK, helped bring to end the Reconstruction, but we're going to be looking at it from a more political view this time, which is the re-election of Grant, as well as kind of the dubious election of Rutherford B. Hayes, and this downfall with this idea of Reconstruction, and how the Democrats end up taking control of the House and the Senate, and really how that kind of changes how to view Reconstruction. And frankly, a lot of people were very tired of dealing with Reconstruction when they wanted to deal with other things. There's also an economic crash that happens, the Panic of 1873, which disrupts much of the United States as well as other parts of the world. And this panic really ends up having people wanting to focus on other things. And so that's in 1873. It's important to know that between 1869 and 1874, that 7 states were considered redeemed, and that was the term of the time, redeemed, to white democratic rule. And this was partially because of the myth of black rule, the rise of the KKK, but also with the downturn in the economy, and also so many corruption, problems with corruption surrounding the Grant administration. Particularly with William Marcy Tweed, and his life dates are 1823 to 1878. And Boss Tweed was in New York. He was a politician. He ended up spending millions and doing corrupt dealings, stealing millions and corrupt dealings from his constituents. And he was seen as part of the problem. Now, Grant himself wasn't corrupt. There's no indication that he was, but the Republican Party gets a name of being corrupt, and not only of like taking bribes or doing dishonest things, but also as too supportive of African Americans. They were, it's viewed that they were invasive in the South, that they had military actions that were viewed as unconstitutional. And also they weren't giving as much amnesty to ex-Confederates. And on top of that, Grant is seen as, throughout this corruption, that he is helping too much of the helping too much of African Americans and not giving enough to whites and Democrats and Republicans in their own. His attack against the KKK actually backfires somewhat. That it's seen as, well, you're helping everything for African Americans. Now what about us? What about us when we are having a panic that happens 2 years later? You're having too much that is being spent down there. And also, the Republican Party is named as being corrupt. There's corruption in the North just as much as the South. Louisiana has a lot of bribes that are taken. There are voter problems that are voter intimidations that are happening in the South as well as the North. And so this is seen as kind of, it needed to be reconciled. And the Democratic Party ends up coming out on top of this, but not before Grant is reelected. Grant ends up running against the great liberal Republican Horace Greeley, and actually Democrats support Horace Greeley to get out the war hero Grant. Horace Greeley was the editor and owner of the New York Tribune. His life dates are 1811 to 1872. And Democrats get on board with Greeley as a defeat. Greeley is seen as being non-corruptible, even though Grant wasn't corrupted. Greeley also exposed some of the corruption that was happening through his newspaper. There's amazing political cartoons at this time of having Horace Greeley is like lifting up different groups as well, and is showing like Grant is being corrupt, and he is like walking on the bones of the Democrats and of white populace in general, while giving helping hands to African Americans. I mean, the political cartoons at this time are just elaborate and decadent, and are really impressive, I would say. They're attacking very hard and at the belt. Greeley is not being successful. Obviously, he's not one of our presidents. And Grant ends up taking 56% of all Northerners. He also has 10 of the 16 southern states and the border states as well. Congress ends up taking and controlling the House and the Senate. However, Republicans are losing ground. As I said, the corruption, the fact that Grant goes against the KKK in a very public mean. There's corruption in Louisiana, and more African American rights are removed. And it's seen that emancipation is no longer ideal, but corruptive, that it is trying to punish the South instead of embracing the South. Northerners were tired of hearing about the South, frankly. They wanted new priorities. They wanted to look at the economy. They wanted to look at the West with the Transcontinental Railroad in completion. They wanted to look at exploiting the West. As one Republican officer, and he put it bluntly and succinctly, quote, "Truth is our people are tired out with this worn out cry of the Southern outrages, hard times, and heavy taxes, and making them wish the African American expletive and the everlasting expletive were in the hell or in Africa." And actually, there's so much so that there's a movement of trying to get freed African Americans back to Africa, and there's big driving forces of saying, "Here, we'll pay your way if you go to Liberia and other places." Liberia is actually named for the liberation of slaves. There's also something called the Exoduster, which happens in 1876, and where Kansas is advertising. There's an advertisement that goes around saying that Kansas and the Midwest wants former slaves to go up there to make sure that they can resettle, and they're going to get all this land and everything. And there's a huge migration that happens up there, and they find that they're just as unwanted there as they were in the South, and they don't have this land and whatnot. But that's called the Exoduster. You have Republicans kind of are getting tired of fighting the view of the Democrats, and in 1874, the Democrats gained control of the House for the first time in 18 years. Massachusetts the most abolitionist of all states, ends up electing a Democratic governor. Republican Party leaders throughout the economic downturn of the Panic of 1873 end up getting voted out because they were seen as having too much taxes and being too harmful. And in 1875, Republicans wanted to unload some of the burden of what do they call the carpetbagger governments. And Democrats end up putting in 1875 the Mississippi Plan to put economic pressure, as we had talked about before. And so this is naked intimidation that is happening in Mississippi. Grant's second term is rocked by scandals in the White House, not so much with him. The Democratic governor for president, Samuel J. Tilden, is a reformed governor who he ends up exposing Boss Tweed. Tilden ends up... he used the word reform 12 times in his platform, and there's this call for the end of carpetbagger governments. They're having the idea of black rule. The Republicans end up nominating in the election of 1876 Rutherford B. Hayes. He was a Union general. He was moderate when it came to construction, and he was really kind of, the violence in the South marred the election. If Tilden won the whole South, then they needed only New York, Indiana, or New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut to have a Democratic president. On election day, Tilden carried all 4 of the states, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and Indiana, and it appeared that he had won the presidency by 250,000 popular vote. But the question was that 250,000 voters intimidated in the South? So what happens is the Electoral College had to decide, and they had not decided the election results of 3 states, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, and all of whom were accused of voter fraud. that was happening. Who really won? They didn't know. And so much voter fraud that there were people coming in from other states to vote. There were people voting multiple times. There was intimidation of votes that were happening. There were people being abused and beaten at the time. You had people who were executed, and then some people voted. So the question is, who took it? Did Hayes take it, or did Tilden? And so they ended up putting it. The board counted the votes that were Republican, which was a surprise, and they gave the votes to Hayes. And this kind of ignites a fever pitch that hadn't happened since the Civil War. And people began to threaten another civil war over this. And so Congress set up a commission to resolve the problem. It created... it wanted to have 5 members of the House, 5 members from the Senate, 5 members of the Supreme Court. And in theory, there were 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent. And this independent was named David Davis from Illinois. And by late January of 1877, Grant approved the commission, but then finds out that David Davis had been elected to the Senate. So Davis removes himself from the congressional review because that meant it would be too many senators. So the person that replaced him was actually was a Republican. So there was an 8 to 7 Republican majority. And so what ends up happening is the Senate does accept the decision, but the Democrats are angry, and so they force the compromise, which is the Compromise of 1878. And this is a big compromise. They would allow Hayes to be president. Hayes had to have internal funding for the South, to including looking at Texas, specifically the railroad system there. Texas is hit by a huge hurricane during the time, and Galveston and some of the ports are closed. So there's this idea that they need to have better railroads. Hayes also had to appoint Southerners to the cabinet, particularly the Postmaster General, which is mainly it's considered more as a puppet kind of thing. But what happened is that, yes, it had prestige, but they also appointed other people. So they had to appoint people who were Democrats to fill in more positions as Democrats. Hayes let South Carolina and Louisiana governments go to a Democratic party, and he also needed to allow protected African American rights in the states. Those were the conditions of the compromise. Now, in February 1877, negotiations happened, and Hayes became president. But what did he do? He did appoint Democrats and liberal Republicans. He withdrew federal troops from South Carolina to allow it to fall to a democracy. To the Democrats in April of 1877. But he did not keep any of his claims to help African Americans with their rights. So abolitionists and radical Republicans denounced Hayes' removal of the troops. And the majority of Americans, after 4 years of war and decades of peace, were like, why do we need to continue with Reconstruction? White Democrats ended up taking control of the South. Black conditions sank further and further into servitude, with an increase in sharecropping, restrictive black code laws, and Jim Crow laws that come about out of this. And so what ends up happening is that not a lot has changed in the Reconstruction South. It's not refigured. It still has the class system. It still has the equivalent of white plantation owners with sharecroppers. It does at least have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that are ratified, but it's pretty much a split it still has that split and is not interracial as it could have been. So a lot of people call Reconstruction nothing but freedom, and freedom in name only, which is because of the amendments. So the question is whether you have not only whether you have a presidential or a congressional Reconstruction, who should have led that. You also have the idea of what really happened with Reconstruction, how could it have been dealt with better. And there's a lot of political theories out there that are saying had Lincoln survived, it would have been gradual and it would have been less punitive, and you wouldn't have had Johnson taking the fight in which he did with Congress. At the same time, with this the rampant racism, the whole myth of black rule really counterdicts some of the policy changes that can happen, as you could see with the Freedmen's Bureau removing, even the removal of the KKK Act that was supposed to help. Nothing greatly approved for African Americans except that they could vote. Only men could vote, not women, and we'll see that become very contentious. And so, largely, Reconstruction was long, but the question is, how effective was it? And so when you're doing your readings from the book as well as from the primary and secondary sources, keep in mind, do you think Reconstruction was necessary? Do you think there could have been anything that changed it or altered it? How persuasive was Reconstruction in the South? Did it actually change Southern culture from prior to the Civil War, which unfortunately you don't have in this class? But did it change racial relations in the United States? Could it have? Did it change the conflict between the North and the South within economies? A planters' agrarian culture in the South versus a urban development and culture in the North, and we'll see that as class progresses. So I hope you enjoyed learning about Reconstruction, and we'll see you next week when we talk about the West.